Hello, this is medieval Christian and Jewish art. So you have quite a number of chapters to choose from this week, from chapter 29, Art of Early Medieval Europe, through chapter 34, Art of the Mediterranean, 35, the Romanesque style, 36, the Gothic style, and 37, the art of the late Middle Ages in Italy. So we have a huge amount to cover in this period that we call medieval. So technically speaking, the Middle Ages begins in the year 476 in the Common Era, when the fall of Rome occurs, when the last Roman emperor in the West is actually deposed. And this initiates a period of tremendous transition. We've got Germanic tribes coming in from the north and the east, moving all across Europe and settling, for example, the Angles and the Saxons settling in England and in that area, the Celts in the British Isles. We've got the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths coming south into Italy and Spain. And what this does is it creates a huge sort of tumultuous moment for art where a lot of different groups are coming into contact with each other and therefore borrowing each other's styles. So it's a huge transition in the early Middle Ages, say up through about the 9th century or early 10th century. And then as political polities start to settle, we get not a Frankish kingdom, but France, not Germanic tribes, but the beginnings of Germany, etc. We start to see a solidification into two major styles, Romanesque first and then Gothic. And these are the hallmark styles of the Middle Ages. In the medieval period as well, the church, the Christian church, is the most powerful institution. Therefore, it is also the wealthiest. And so it is the number one commissioner and patron for art. And so we're not really seeing personal art in this period as much as art in service of the Christian religion. And this is a budding Jewish art. The Jews are obviously predating the Christians by several centuries. And in the period when Christianity becomes a legal religion in about the 4th century, Jewish populations start to move to the margins. In a sense, Christianity is expanding and pushing Jews out of the centers of cities, et cetera. And so we start to see a codification of Jewish art in opposition to, but alongside the development of Christian art. So the places that we'll be looking at today in Western Europe look somewhat familiar to our modern map, but they're in a process of transition, as I mentioned. So here on the left, we have an early sort of first agglomeration of power under a dynasty called the Carolingians, and they're named after Charlemagne, Charles the Great, who was their sort of most powerful, responsible for the most territorial expansion, for consolidating centralized power in his court. And that's the yellow area that we're seeing. It's called the Frankish Kingdom, named after various Frankish groups that solidify into this Carolingian dynasty. We should also remember, as we talked about the other week, that the Arabic caliphates have spread across North Africa and invaded into the Iberian Peninsula, where more than half of it is still in Muslim hands. Some years later, about 3 centuries later, we start to see the polities taking more of a familiar form compared to what we know today. So we can see that England is sort of consolidated from all of these different Anglo and Saxon tribes, Jutes, other tribes. We see that Spain, Christian Spain, has now pushed Muslim Spain about halfway down. And so this area will be the last to fall in 1496. The Kingdom of France is starting to expand into these various duchies that are all under the rule of the King of France. And then this area known as the Holy Roman Empire, which does own part of modern day France, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, etc. This is all the remnants of what remains from Charlemagne's kingdom. And so this Holy Roman Empire has an important view of itself as sort of the retainer of Charlemagne's claim to Christian power. Finally, Italy in this period is very fragmented, does not become consolidated really until the 19th century in the state of Italy. Sorry, my hair is driving me crazy. Haircuts will do that. And you can see that these are all different city-states. So you've got a central city with sort of the hinterlands around it, but it's very, very fragmented, and each city-state has its own ruling class. And so the impact of all of this fragmentation and change on art is that we really start to see a very creative period happening in what we call the Middle Ages. One of the ways that art serves religion is through the written word, and both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam on this Abrahamic spectrum are all keepers of this textual tradition rooted in the Old Testament, this Abrahamic religion, for Christianity, also the New Testament, and then for Islam, the Quran. But these holy texts are understood as the word of God. And so therefore they have to be treated with just the most respect and veneration. And for Christianity and Judaism, seen here, this results in the creation of illuminated manuscripts. A manuscript is a document written by hand, manuscriptus. And illumination means the decoration specifically with gold and silver leaf. So here on the left, we have an early example of a Gospels book, which has calendars, saints' days, prayers, and then the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this is a very famous one coming from a little island monastery in England known as Lindisfarne, which was ultimately attacked by the Vikings, etc. But what you see here is a carpet page called the Chi Rho page. And Chi, the X, and Rho, the R, are the 2 first letters of the word for Christ in Greek. And so this page is the opening of a gospel. And it's actually the Gospel of Matthew. And you can see how the decoration in the Chi Rho actually almost looks like metal filigree that we've seen before, this very, very detailed, curlicue, interlaced, interwoven type of structure. And throughout the gospel books, we also see examples of little animal heads and serpents and birds and all of these other creatures almost hiding in the intricate interlacing of this style. On the right, we have the Golden Haggadah. And the Haggadah is a book that's used during the Jewish ceremony of Passover. And we can actually see an example of the gold leaf here. So manuscript artists take gold and hammer it down so it's 1 atom thick, and then they apply it with usually an egg-based glue to create this sort of very flattened, 2-dimensional background of gold. And this just makes the book that much more valuable. It's literal gold on the pages. In the center, we can see an example from the Lindau Gospels, which are actually held at the Morgan Library in New York. This is the type of cover that was on these precious books. So the word of God is precious, the gold in the pages and the skill of the artist is precious, and the cover is also precious. So these are really the most sort of culminatory and at the pinnacle of medieval art, these manuscripts. And here we can see a Christ figure on a cross is done with repoussé, right? Pushed from the back, hammered out from the back, where we have little angels flying around. And the whole thing is absolutely studded with precious gems and pearls and filigree and just sumptuous wealth. As a period of transition, as the Christian Holy Roman Empire is developing under Charlemagne, Charlemagne understands himself this powerful emperor that's unifying in the wake of the fall of Rome. He understands himself as the defender of the faith, and he's actually crowned by the Pope. So we're seeing a combination of church and empire in this period when the Carolingian Empire is coming to power in the late 8th century. Charlemagne does something that we've seen before. He employs archaism to reinforce his claim to power. And so this might look very familiar to you. This is his central imperial complex in the city of Aachen, which is today Aix-la-Chapelle in northern France, but at this point in what we would call Germany today, very ephemeral borders. And you can see that the structure of it looks very much like the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, which had been a capital of the Roman Empire. And so moving from Italy, around this ancient capital of Rome during the Roman Empire, to this Germano-Franco border, Charlemagne is borrowing this vision of what imperial power looks like. And so he's taking the same model of San Vitale and transposing it into his new capital. And so here's a glimpse inside. We'll be looking interior here for a second, but you see it has the same 2 levels, the sort of octagonal shape, the 2 tiers. This is called the clerestory window. And what this does is it tells people that he is literally inheriting the power that was contingent in Ravenna. Like if you remember the mosaics of Justinian and Theodora, Charlemagne is borrowing that. And so here's the interior. And we can see another familiar image here in these vaults we can see this interlaying of dark and light marble. And so this is just like the ablaq that we saw used by Islamic artists in the Great Mosque in Cordoba in Spain. We also see a number of other elements that are speaking to Charlemagne's power. So first of all, a lot of gold, these very, very sumptuous, gleaming chandeliers and all other kinds of decoration. Every inch of this, again, is painted, has marble. It's an extremely overwhelmingly beautiful space. And here on the right, we can actually see Charlemagne's throne. So using art to support his power, not only as emperor, but as Christian emperor, Charlemagne puts himself literally above the rest of his retinue, anybody in his entourage. He's raised above them in this marble throne. Other things that would be kept in places like Charlemagne's chapel, in cathedrals, in churches, are reliquaries. And over the course of the Middle Ages, relics start to play a very important role. Now, a relic, from the Latin reliquus, that which has been left behind, are body parts of saints. They're also things that saints used, things that touched body parts of saints, or things that saints used. But the primary type of relic in the Middle Ages was literally a body part of somebody who walked among us and was very, very holy, did not have to suffer, went straight to heaven, was favored by God, could effect miracles, and served as an intercessor between humanity and God. Meaning that if a person comes to a reliquary which holds the relics, they can pray to the reliquary and the saint will carry those prayers to God instead of having to go to this fearsome God directly. So here on the left, you'll have read about Sainte Foy, Saint Faith. This was a young girl who was martyred in the early period of Roman persecution in the late third and early fourth century. And her body, her skull, is actually inside this reliquary. And you can see that the reliquaries are just as elaborate and rich as the manuscripts, right? What's inside them is precious, and therefore the box that those precious relics are held in has to exhibit this profound sacrality and wealth and dominance of the church's power. So Sainte Foy is a great example of what we call spolia, because her head actually comes from a different statue or perhaps a helmet. So it's not the face of a young girl, but it's put on this little body with her relics inside. And again, just like the jeweled cover of the Lindau Gospels, encrusted with pearls and gemstones. And even here, another example of spolia, a little cameo that belonged to Roman art that was taken and sort of inserted into this new milieu, this new motif of the reliquary body. And so just think about how these eyes would appear to somebody who was probably illiterate, who was afraid of the power of God, who needed a prayer answered, approaching in the candlelight that's glimmering off of this entirely gold body. Reliquaries are often in the shape of whatever relic are inside. So here, this is actually from the cloisters, is an arm reliquary. We don't know what saint it belongs to, but these little apertures here, which would have been covered with crystal, allow somebody to see inside and see that sacred arm bone that's in there. Hand is in the shape of a blessing. Gold and silver gilt, and a tactic we call niello, which we've encountered before, where certain metallic substances are ground down and then fired into enameled plates, which will harden into this black shape. Here we have the reliquary bust of Saint Juliana. She's also a 4th century martyr, somebody who dies for the faith or is killed for the faith. This reliquary, which is life-size and very realistic looking compared to Sainte Foy, right? So there's a tremendous spectrum of the way that these are created. This actually holds a piece of her skull, or used to, not in the museum anymore. You can see the hinge here where it would open and you would be able to put the skull fragment inside. Her hair is gilded and she has a very welcoming face. So again, this idea of somebody approaching her with prayers would find her very receptive. Finally, we have the reliquary box of Thomas Becket, who was martyred in 1170. He was first the best friend and then an enemy of the King of England. And what's unique about this particular box, also known as a chasse or a casket, is we actually see the images of his martyrdom. He was attacked by knights in the cathedral at Canterbury in England while he was celebrating the Mass. So just to kind of give you a smattering view of the different types of reliquaries that exist, we've got them for everything: hair, nail fragments, bones, teeth, the Virgin Mary's milk, Christ's foreskin from his circumcision, foot reliquaries, literally, you name it, there are reliquaries for that thing. And I should point out as well that the reliquaries are prompting the spread of pilgrimage. People are traveling from reliquary site to reliquary site to reliquary site to pray to these particular saints to earn their favor. So, as I mentioned, the church is the most powerful institution in the Middle Ages. It's also the largest landholder and the number one patron of architecture. So we've got parish churches, which are little local churches. We've got grand cathedrals. We've got monasteries for monks. We've got convents for nuns. We've got chapels inside palaces. All of these different forms are serving to glorify the Christian religion and to communicate messages about Christianity to a largely illiterate laity, which are non-church people. So here you have a couple of sort of generalizable views of the architecture that we'll see throughout the rest of this lecture. Buildings of churches are typically on a cross shape, right? Because Jesus was crucified on a cross, the cross is a holy object. So you have this long period, this long sort of hallway almost called the nave. And this is the area that you would walk towards the apse. And the apse is in the east, it's usually rounded. This is where the altar is. So this is the holiest part of the church. Also, the fact that this is at the east means that as the sun is rising, crisp, clean light on the altar, the sun transmits through the whole sky. And then in the evening, the west end, where the rose window is, which we'll see in a moment, gets this beautiful sunlight colored light coming through it, which casts beautiful shadows on the ground, speckled light, etc. So it's really built into this world organization that helps to facilitate the church sort of showing different sides or performing different services. Crossing the nave is the transept, which is the short part of the cross. We also have aisles where people can walk and look at, for example, different chapels, different works of art, reliquaries, etc., and then the ambulatory around the apse. The front of the church, which is usually you enter majorly at the west end. This is the grand entrance area. There are usually smaller entrances on each side of the transept, the north and south, but this is the main facade that you see if you were to like Google a picture of a church. And so what you would see there is a portal, a big doorway with a tympanum, plural tympana, above the doors. And the tympanum is a great place to have a carving because as people are entering the church for church service, they're going to read the iconography of whatever is in the tympanum. So typically, you'll see a major scene from Christianity in the tympanum to remind people as they're walking into the church that they should be thinking about this thing. We also start to see the proliferation of sculpture all around the doorway. So in the trumeau, which is the center column, in the door jambs, which are sort of radiating out on the sides of the doorways, and then also in the voussoir or the archivolts that circle over the top of the tympanum. We'll also see different types of vaults inside the church. So we've got semicircular or barrel vault here, which is just kind of like one single rounded archway. And then we start to see rib vaulting where sort of very narrow strips of brick or stone are supporting a plaster vault. So rather than the whole thing being very, very heavy in stone, the use of plaster alleviates the weight and enables these vaults to be pointed, to be higher, and we'll see that in the Gothic style. Here are all of the different elements of the different layers of the church. So you can just look at this at your leisure, and we'll be talking about buttressing in a second. So the two styles that I mentioned, the Romanesque and the Gothic, are generalizably speaking, the move from rounded to pointed. So here on the left at Speyer Cathedral in Germany, we see a really good example of a Romanesque church. And Romanesque, of course, is looking back to ancient Rome, borrowing Roman style architecture. So a Roman law court might look a lot like this. A basilica might have this long nave in the center, and then in the front, sort of where the dignitaries would sit. That same view is being borrowed for churches. And so here you have the transept. Here's the east end with the apse, and this is actually a rounded apse. You can just barely see it. Here's the nave, And then here's the western facade where people would enter as that main entrance. So this is oriented sort of the opposite way. And we can see that the windows have rounded tops and that they're fairly small, especially down here. They're letting in some light, but the problem is that these barrel vaults are heavy. And so the church walls for the Romanesque churches need to be thick, which means that they can't afford much space for windows. Also, we often have heavy cupolas and just a lot of weight coming down. And if you're in a Romanesque space, you feel kind of close, it feels heavy, it feels low, it's often very dark. By contrast, architectural developments, including buttressing, which is the reinforcement from the outside of church walls, enables the Gothic style, which you see here embodied in Chartres Cathedral in France. It enables more verticality because the walls can be thinner, the windows can be more open because everything is being supported from outside rather than in the Romanesque style where the walls themselves are supporting all of the architectural elements. So here you'll see the transept. Here's the nave area. Here's the western facade, and then the apse is over here on the east. And you'll note rose windows, which we'll talk about. But just look at the difference in the style of the towers, especially. Much, 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 much higher, pointier. And this pointy aspect serves throughout the Gothic structure, including the way the windows are shaped, the way the arches inside are shaped. So let's go inside. Remember, Romanesque, Gothic. The buttressing that I mentioned is in full force here in Notre Dame in Paris. And the buttressing enables, as I mentioned, the weight to be redistributed out. So instead of the building holding its own weight, so if the arch is pushing down a certain thrust, the wall is absorbing it in the Romanesque style, here we're externalizing it. And these buttresses, and the flying buttresses especially, so these make it flying buttresses that they're removed away from the wall. These enable the thrust of the arch to be pushed out and down, and then out and down, rather than the wall itself having to support the whole thing. And again, what this does is it enables us to open up the windows and make the walls thinner, and then we can put stained glass in the windows. Here's a rose window as well. So the Romanesque sculptural style, which we'll see in Tympana, for example, at Sainte-Foy in Conques, which you'll have watched the video about. This is one of the major pilgrimage sites because people really want to come and see that reliquary of Sainte-Foy. You can see that it's very flattened. And the image that we're seeing here as you enter into the church is one of last judgment. Christ is going to measure out all the good things you did against all the bad things you did and weigh out your sins. And you will either be allowed to go to heaven or you will be sent to hell for all eternity. So we see Christ in a mandorla, this full body halo, looking very dominant. He's on a throne. His arms are up in a sense of judgment, like you're going there and you're going there. His face is very severe. And if we look at the way the folds are and the way the body is, it's very sort of stylized, right? It doesn't really look like how a normal person would sit with the folds of their fabric kind of going between their legs. He's very two-dimensional. And this is typical of the Romanesque style. Also, the folds are completely flattened as though somebody made folds and then ironed them down. So this is quite an intimidating thing to see as you're entering into this church. Even more intimidating is the scene of damnation at the bottom here. And you can see a little hell mouth. This is the sort of opening maw of hell swallowing up the sinners. Here close up, we can see snakes wrapped around sinners, demons tormenting them, a sort of demonic face here, unhappy sinners here. So just imagine you're walking into church and you're like, okay, I am reminded of the end of days. I am reminded of what's going to happen to my eternal soul. I better behave. So this message is being communicated. You can also see traces of the polychromy. So these would have been painted and not, straight, clear or white marble. So think back to what we talked about with Roman Greece, much more colorful than has survived. By contrast, the Gothic style is less two-dimensional, more three-dimensional. So the bodies are modeled as though they're real bodies, as though they have weight. So look by comparison at the Virgin Mary here in the scene of the coronation of the Virgin, whereas Jesus's lap here is almost like a little table with these flattened folds. We see here as though she has two legs, as though the folds are falling in between her legs in this naturalistic way. We also see a lot more humanistic and realistic architecture. So again, where Jesus is sort of very stern and stylized, here we have the so-called smiling angel of Reims Cathedral. And this angel looks like a real person, right? There's naturalism, there's anthropomorphism, and expression, there's emotion. And again, the body is actually sort of situated and sculpted the way a real body might move, not so stylized or two-dimensional. And I just want to point out that scenes like this are part of a movement to humanize Jesus. So instead of that stern judge that we just saw at Conques, here we have Jesus as born of a woman who is also here. And it's this sort of Queen of Heaven, King of Heaven motif where Jesus is crowning the Virgin Mary, his mother. So a reminder that he is human because he came from her. All right, so inside the Romanesque and Gothic styles here, it becomes immediately clear the difference, right? We have rounded arches, these single barrel vaults, and very stark and sort of stoic architecture. There's not a lot of decoration. There's also not a lot of light. You can see a little bit of light cast in from the windows, but look how dark the apse area is. There's not a lot going on here. It's just sort of very stark. By contrast, in the Gothic style, we have these ribs, which give us the rib vaults, right? These sort of rows of mortar or rows of stone or brick, which support the plaster vaults here. And so the point serves to draw the eye upwards towards heaven. The same thing using very, very narrow compared to these thicker columns, also elongates, makes it feel lighter, makes it feel more delicate inside a Gothic structure. And then finally, you'll notice the stained glass. So this enables the apse to be much, much lighter than in a Romanesque cathedral. We have much more window space and a real attention to the way that light is playing on these surfaces. And the Gothic style comes out of France. So we'll be looking at a number of French examples today. Probably the hallmark of the Gothic style, which even goes beyond the regular Gothic into what we call the Gothic rayonnant, is the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. This was built to house one of the most important reliquaries of Jesus, the crown of thorns. And the crown of thorns was actually more expensive than it cost to build this incredibly expensive building. So on the outside, and you'll see this in the Khan Academy video, we see all of these hallmarks of Gothic. We see the buttressing here, not flying, but still external. We see all of the points. Everything is as pointy as possible, drawing the eye up, drawing the eye up. All these little decorative elements here serving to elongate and make more vertical. Here we have the rose window. And then we can see that these lancet windows are very, very long with a point on top. When you go inside into the upper chapel, it's like being in a jewelry box. Every single inch is covered with decoration. We've got almost like a starry sky up here with gilded ribs, these long, long, narrow columns, all covered with pattern, and then nonstop stained glass. This is the area where the crown of thorns would have been held. And so the very, very narrow pointed lancet windows here, again, just draw the eye up and make one meditate on the relationship between earth and heaven. And so I hope you enjoy the 360 video of this. It's exquisite inside. The other aspect of the Gothic is the use of rose windows, called so because clearly they look like flowers. And as I mentioned, the rose window is typically at the west end so that the sunset light comes through. So with this exquisite kaleidoscope of reds and blues and purples and pinks, just think of what the light will be doing on the floor, the marble floor of the cathedral, right? I mean, you'll feel like you're walking into heaven itself. So this one is at Notre Dame and this one is at Sainte-Chapelle. And they each have different kinds of images involved. For example, this one depicts images of the apocalypse. Gold is also an excellent way to spiritualize or make religious an event in daily life. And so here we have from the Colmar treasure, a Jewish wedding ring. The Colmar treasure, as you'll learn from the video, is very special because it was found completely by accident in the 19th century, buried in a wall. And the reason it was buried was because in the period that this Jewish family owned this huge treasure, this personal treasure that included beautiful metallic belts, rings, 300 coins of different types, all kinds of little details that have been preserved by this family, including this wedding ring, had to be hidden because at the time the Black Death had broken out and was ravaging Western Europe, and this is around 1348. And so in order to come to terms with the damage done by the plague, there was a tremendous amount of scapegoating against Jews. And so the entire population of Jews in Colmar, which is in northeastern France, was actually put to death as a result, executed. So it's a sad story, but we're so lucky that this has survived, this collection, and you'll see some of the other objects in the video. What you see here is taking the Gothic style and minimizing it down into a usable object. So we have points, we have these beautiful arches with narrow pillars, almost like the shape of lancet windows. We have all this floral decoration. Everything is drawing the eye topwards. And so this is a wedding ring that would have been given by the groom to the bride in a Jewish wedding ceremony. And the purpose of it is to commemorate the idea of the Jewish temple, which was destroyed first under King Solomon and then in the year 70 by the Romans. And the temple in Jerusalem was the center of Jewish identity. And so there's this idea that in evoking the temple, a wedding is bringing together two people to make a temple of their home. And the Jewish figures at the top here actually spell out Mazel Tov, congratulations. So this is a tremendously significant heirloom for this family that would have been passed down generation to generation. And originally the enamel here was green, but most of it has chipped off, leaving only the red around the Hebrew letters. But again, you can see how this is mimicking the artistic style of churches or of other Gothic structures like the Sainte-Chapelle. So we're seeing an awareness between Jewish and Christian traditions. Finally, moving out of the period of Gothic work towards what we would call Renaissance humanism, we see a new style of frescoes that tells the lives of religious people in Christianity. And so here, for example, as just one sort of iconic example of this style is Giotto. Giotto, who was a student of another famous Italian painter, Cimabue, is responsible for creating a whole host of different frescoes. So remember the application of paint to wet plaster, dedicated to the life of St. Francis. Now, St. Francis, who was living in the early 13th century, is a saint who specifically rejects the wealth of the church. And as such, he becomes a sort of champion of poverty and of spirituality versus landed wealth, giant cathedrals, golden reliquaries, all of that. For him, religion is personal between him and Jesus. And so he starts a tradition that we call mendicant monks, mendicant friars, including the Franciscans, the Dominicans, also a women's group called the Clarissans. These people reject living in these wealthy church-funded and church-supported structures. They are begging friars, begging monks. So they live as monks, but they live in the outside world dependent on the charity of others. For St. Francis, his relationship with Jesus specifically was of utmost importance. And so Giotto here has used the fresco style to decorate the walls of chapels in Assisi, where St. Francis is from, in Italy, in Florence, where we have this series dedicated to St. Francis in Santa Croce, which is the Holy Cross Church in Florence, Italy. And what this does is, again, communicates Christian values to illiterate populations. So on the left, we see an image of St. Francis receiving the stigmata. Now, you're probably most familiar with the stigmata from horror films, but the stigmata means the marks that Jesus suffered on the cross appearing on a very devout person. So here we have a little image of a crucifix, and this scene comes directly from the life of St. Francis, written by one of his fellow Franciscan monks. And you can see it's a seraph, so he has 6 wings. But the wounds that Christ is suffering on his hands, on his feet, from the crown of thorns, and the wound in his right side, these are the wounds of Christ that he receives on the cross before his death. Each of these is almost like laser beamed to the corresponding body part of St. Francis himself. And you'll note that he's wearing a very simple brown robe, which he patches. He doesn't get a new one when it's torn. He's the embodiment of poverty and focusing on meditation instead. And so in this vision, St. Francis receives the stigmata. He's the first known stigmatic in history. On the right, we see the death of St. Francis. And this is classic Giotto. We see so much emotion in these faces. So the background is fairly stable. This is just a detail of the larger mural. St. Francis is laying here dead, and we can see this monk is kissing his hand. We see pain and concern on the faces of these individuals, and here pure grief. So moving from the sort of very stylized, even though there's a hint of emotion in some like the Reims Angel, it's not until the Renaissance that we're really evoking physical expression to represent emotion. And so Giotto is sort of bridging the medieval and Renaissance styles in Italy, which is at the forefront of where Renaissance styles develop. So in both of these cases, it's a message communicated, right? If you are like St. Francis, maybe Jesus will bless you with a stigmata. Look how holy he is, and look how simple he is. And then here, look at the impact that he's left. You too should be leaving money to this chapel dedicated to St. Francis, or supporting the Franciscans you meet on the street by giving them alms or charity. So in both of these cases, using a much softer palette than we see, for example, in medieval manuscripts, Giotto is communicating emotion as well as narrative. Okay, so here are all of your different terms. Good luck on your quiz. Thank you.